And please acknowledge that. And then I will go ahead and give an introduction. This is the first time I've met Hannah, although we have talked on the phone. Hannah works as a senior analyst at Population Connection. She focuses on public speaking and the development of open source academic style resources. She also cultivates partnerships between PopConnect and international non-governmental organizations. Before joining PopConnect staff, Hannah worked as an adjunct professor of women's studies and taught classes on gender, science, and feminist theory. She has nonprofit experience working as a program developer for sustainable agriculture and public health programs in Honduras and Panama, and has worked as a researcher studying food security issues throughout Southern California. She has a BA in environmental policy and natural resource conservation and political science, and a master's in political ecology from San Diego State University. So, Hannah, I'll let you take it away. We're recording, and anybody that comes in late, I'll try and admit them. Thank you. Go ahead.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for that introduction, and thanks everyone for having me. It's nice to be here with you all tonight. My name is Hannah Evans, as Roger mentioned, and I work as the senior analyst for an organization called Population Connection. And Population Connection is a US-based nonprofit organization, and we do a lot of work in the educational spaces and also advocacy. From a more political sphere, we are focused on increasing US funding for family planning programs internationally. And domestically, we focus a lot on education and outreach, specifically surrounding the major themes behind global demographic trends and population, access to resources like healthcare and education, and environmental sustainability. And a lot of the work that I do within this organization focuses on the connections between population and climate change. And in particular, the ways in which expanding gender equality can aid in climate adaptation and resilience building. So this presentation today is going to cover a lot of information at the sort of macro level, global scales. We're going to be looking into the history of global population growth, how it intersects with various other social, economic, and environmental issues within society. We're going to be looking at climate change and climate vulnerability and how population affects that. And ultimately, I'm going to be arguing that expanding gender equality through healthcare and education, specifically for everybody, but in particular for women and girls, needs to be better understood as being one very important and powerful modality, of course, to sustainable development, but also very much to climate adaptation and resilience building. Okay, so this is the first introductory slide that I like to use just to introduce the sort of theoretical basis for this work. So we use what's called a PHE, or a population health and environment approach to developmental solutions. So that means that we're really looking at the very integrative nature of development and of issues within societies, recognizing that people are interacting with their environments, or interacting with their economies and social structures and everything, not in isolation from one another, but in these like really interdependent sort of contexts and dynamics. So for example, if we're interested in looking at how and why people are interacting with their environment in certain ways, it's much more effective for us to understand also what the socioeconomic context is, what the levels of poverty are, who has access to resources and who doesn't, who has access to healthcare. If we understand that health and well-being and poverty very much come into play with environmental sustainability, because they do, and we'll get into that, we can much more effectively create solutions that are foundationally and fundamentally tackling the issues that we're now facing. This is kind of a theory that's based off of the concept that I think we're all being bombarded with now as we're facing these existential crises, in particular that of climate change, which is that we need to start understanding and integrating the fact that our own survival as a species is very much predicated on more cohesion with the environment and on healthy ecosystems and healthy environments. So our development strategies need to embody that principle. Also, the same systems of oppression, of course, that exploit people are also destroying the environment, right? So in order to kind of tackle this, we need to be looking at the issue holistically and from a comprehensive perspective and building solutions from that place. So we partner with a lot of different organizations around the world that work in the space of PHE, but that relate or do work in some way related to our mission, which is quite broad. And just for context here into PHE, I've included one such organization. They are Path Foundation Philippines, or PFPI, and they use an integrative PHE approach in their developmental strategies. So they work all throughout the very beautiful and large archipelago of the Philippines, which is over 7,000 different islands. And they work in many of them, and they have programs that simultaneously work on social, economic, and environmental issues. So on the one hand, they're working to address issues related to sexual and reproductive health care by increasing access to voluntary family planning services. This is coupled with climate smart development strategies, which in the case of the Philippines has very much to do with sustainable fisheries management systems. And they also include tools for women's empowerment. So in this case, women are actually trained as leaders within their communities and stewards of the land, protectors of natural resources, which is obviously very advantageous for environmental conservation, but also very much working to offset and change the otherwise highly patriarchal and traditional cultural norms, which would otherwise prevent many women and girls from assuming leadership positions within communities or even making decisions, right? So this is a slide with a few pictures from one of the programs. This is a mangrove restoration project that, again, is entirely women run and led. So women are trained, again, about the importance of mangroves, about their surrounding ecosystems and the local environments in which they live. And they're educating their community members about the importance of mangroves and also engaging in restoration efforts. Mangroves have been commodified and extracted for economic gain. And so this program restores through replanting the population of mangroves and also works in a social context, again, to kind of shift these traditional paradigms away from something highly patriarchal and towards something a little bit more egalitarian. Mangroves are really important for marine ecosystems in many different ways, but they act as like marine shelters and homes for much of the marine life that lives in these places. And they also act as really important buffers for storms that are increasing in frequency and intensity because of climate change. So these programs are really vital for climate adaptation, and also, again, are really sort of changing the dominant paradigms and the norms surrounding gender roles and rights. And all of this is to say that we need to start thinking about climate change as being much more than just an environmental issue. Of course, it's an issue that we're all feeling and facing right now. I think it's changing our entire lives, and the landscapes in which we live, the availability of resources, climate, temperature, all of that, right? It's of course very global in scope. But if we look from a social perspective, we can see that because of the unevenness of our systems, people are affected differently along social scales and indicators. For example, if we take women and girls collectively are poorer, more directly dependent on climate-sensitive natural resources for sustenance and livelihoods. Because of patriarchal social structures, which are present throughout the world, arguably, but especially in some of the world's poorest and rural regions, women because of this, have less access to mobility, less access to education, healthcare, and other vital resources. They're also not usually decision makers. So all of this combines to create a disproportionately vulnerable situation for girls and women in comparison to their male counterparts. If we understand that climate change is also a social issue, that opens up pathways for solutions to climate change that might otherwise only be thought of as social in nature, but that have a direct impact on the environment. For example, education. Worldwide, over 130 million girls are denied the basic human right to attend school. This is a very clear and obvious human rights violation, but in a social context, it produces a lot of harm, especially in places that are trying to develop, right? It lowers health outcomes, it stifles financial stability, and it disallows agency and autonomy. This all has to do with the ability to adapt to climate change. In reverse, if education is afforded, then all of these indicators become realized and societies are able to develop. As we're going to get into, education is also very fundamental for slowing population growth through lowering fertility rates, because on average, whenever women gain access to education, they choose to marry later, to have children later, and on average have fewer, healthier children. Another example is through gender equity, and this manifests in many different ways, but one example is through agriculture. So in low-income regions alone, women produce 60 to 80% of the food in these places. And yet, because they have less access to resources like land rights, credits, capital, technology, or training in comparison to men, they end up producing less food on the same amount of land. Research from Project Drawdown, which is a great organization I'm going to be citing several times throughout this presentation, does a lot of research in this space, and they're estimating that farm yields could rise by up to 30% just if these gender gaps were closed. So just if everybody was receiving the same amount of information and tools and resources and help, farm yields could rise by up to 30%. This is a huge deal, right? Given the fact that we're trying, to figure out how we're going to produce more food to feed growing populations without further contributing to climate change. This innovation and understanding also ostensibly could reduce the need for deforestation. Because if people are able to produce more food on less land, that reduces the demand to clear more land to produce more food. All the while, this is happening in a context where women are becoming empowered. So that's kind of the overall thesis of this presentation, is to recognize the integrative approach that we need to be taking to climate change and climate solutions. Many of you might be familiar with the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, which are set forth every 15 or so years, and they're established by the UN. Many different countries around the world sign on to them, sort of symbolically, but with the overall intention of creating a better and more equitable and more sustainable future. Some of the goals, for example, include things like the elimination of poverty, universal education, gender equality, and so on. And the point of this slide is to recognize and understand that achieving climate action, achieving marine conservation, and sustainability on land needs to be thought of within the context of these innovations in social justice and social developments. In my mind, it's impossible to achieve climate action or any type of conservation without working also towards gender equality, without bettering the health and well-being of most people on the planet, and without achieving universal education. That's again because everything is very connected. So again, achieving climate action, really reducing the demand for resources, reducing CO2 emissions over time in a drastic way that will alter the trajectory of climate change and create better and more habitable systems, is very much predicated on these social innovations, on achieving gender equality, on health and well-being, on really realizing and establishing integrated development all around the world that are simultaneously addressing social, economic, and environmental issues within societies. This is also very much predicated on quality education and meeting unmet needs for sexual and reproductive health. These are two aspects that we're going to get into throughout the presentation. Okay, so in terms of climate change, I don't know how environmentalist this group is, but I don't even think I really need to show this slide anymore. I think everybody's kind of on board with what's going on and why. We're all starting to experience climate impacts, and the status of climate change is being widely popularized in mainstream media now. But the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has finally, within the past few years, come out and unequivocally said that human influence is contributing to the temperature increases that we are seeing play out, and that are warming our global temperatures, and that are causing all of these extreme weather events. This is a scientific consensus. It's pretty much unanimous. It arguably always has been, but now we know for sure that this is the reality, that our influence as human beings is contributing to these temperature increases and causing climate change. And I think we're all kind of bombarded. If anyone's, reading the news at all, we get notified pretty much every single day that we are headed towards mass calamity, right? Unless we enact drastic measures that will cut emissions on a global scale very quickly, we're just going to continue to see temperatures increase. This is going to also have climate impacts mount out of control, endangering more people, creating more uninhabitable lands. So this is a problem that we need to be addressing with proper urgency, right? And using every modality that we have available. It's important to also understand that these entities that are coming out, these organizations and groups that are doing all of this research in the climate change space, are also saying, hey, we still have time to avert the worst possible trajectory of climate change and to change things in ways that will better the future, right? That will create more habitable systems. We just need to be, again, doing this quickly and really investing everything we have into solving this problem. And, admittedly, this is a really complex undertaking. So if we're looking at the underlying drivers of climate change and all the contributing factors, it's important to recognize right off the bat that there are many different interconnected challenges facing our world today. And so I want us to be looking at population growth, which is the focus of our organization and my research, as being one of many different interconnected sort of challenges that are all interacting with one another and bouncing off of one another, sort of like a web, right? Where the overarching system of our global capitalist, expansionist, sort of socioeconomic dynamic is largely what we're all operating under, and the thing that ultimately is causing all of these imbalances, right? If we are looking at one of the main underlying drivers of climate change and what's caused it, I think we can look very clearly back to the Industrial Revolution, which occurred about 300 years ago. This is a period of time that was revolutionary for human beings in many different ways, but from an energy perspective, it completely transformed the way that we produce food and energy to be reliant much more on fossil fuels. It also set the basis for a very globalized world economy and large-scale consumption and production at like these big, massive supply chains and production chains. But yeah, it set the basis for like an economies of scale type of production and consumption of fossil fuels, which are causing climate change and fueling a lot of environmental devastation. Consumption of commodities, which are fueling, again, also climate change and a lot of environmental degradation as well. Commodities like meat, for example, which are resulting in a lot of health and environmental issues throughout the world. Again, all really daunting issues. And I am giving these presentations and I talk about things from a macro level and at a global scale. And whenever we look at things from this zoomed out perspective, sometimes it's really daunting and difficult to even imagine what the solutions may be or how we can solve all of these problems. But the point of this presentation and the point of like my work in an NGO and towards like a better future is definitely not to scare anyone or to uh, and infuse any type of like paralysis where we don't feel like we can make any difference because the issues are too big. Not at all. I think for me in this work, it's been really interesting to get to know and kind of understand how everything works, how the world is operating, and what the major problems are, so that we can see how to change them. To me, it's really empowering to know that all of these problems that we've created for ourselves have been of our own creation, right? Um, we have created these processes and these systems and these incentives which are driving our world economy, and it really hasn't been around that long. The Industrial Revolution was only 300 years ago, which is a blink of an eye relative to human history, which means that, you know, things are malleable and subject to change. They need to change, and they are changing, right? But we can, so this information is just information so that we can gain knowledge and then take action. All right, so in terms of the connections between population and the environments, I think many of them are well known, again, at this scale especially. Worldwide, we're affecting the planet in many different ways. We're destroying wildlife habitats, causing species to go extinct. We're changing the chemistries of the oceans. We're using resources unsustainably. And of course, we're all contributing to climate change at varying levels and scales. And historically, many environmentalists have been concerned in this context with the continued growth of the human population for a variety of reasons, but largely because we understand that population growth correlates very linearly to environmental degradation and resource overuse. As you can see here, I've put 5 different examples of this up to show the direct relationship that exists between the historical growth of the human population and a variety of other indicators of ecological decline or resource exploitation. And there are more that I could put up, but just for the sake of space, I kept it to 5 here. And the point is to understand that there is, yes, a direct relationship between population and the environment and resource use. This is a complicated subject, and we're going to get into the nuance later, but this is something that we need to just be looking at and understanding as a way for us, again, to kind of fundamentally know what's going on and then approach solutions from more of a holistic perspective. The Global Footprint Network, which is another great organization that I like to reference a lot in my work, is they do ongoing research kind of assessing the Earth's capacity to regenerate its resources versus human demands. And they have estimated that humanity is now demanding 60% more of our planet than its ecosystems can renew. But in order to maintain 85% of the world's biodiversity, which is very necessary in maintaining a sustainable planet, human demand really should only be using half of what the planet can provide. So this means that current demand exceeds that goal by at least a factor of 3. And I want to be clear again that there are many different reasons for this. It's very complex to look at this issue, right? Many different contributing factors. We could spend an entire hour just looking at this one slide. But also, one of the most important factors behind this growing imbalance is the continued growth of the human population. So we need to be figuring out ways to reintegrate this back into conversations about climate change with a human rights perspective so that we can change what's going on and actually fix these problems. So why is population of import as we're discussing all of these environmental issues? Well, if we look historically, we can see that population growth has been pretty steady over time and has skyrocketed and been exponential at many times in a very short period of time, right? So again, looking at this graph, which is called a J curve, we can see that very clearly that something is out of balance, right? For most of human history, death rates were very high. Fertility rates were high too. Fertility rates being the amount of children a woman has during her childbearing years. But death rates were also very high. Life expectancy was very low. Life in general was kind of precarious. People were moving from one place to another. There was a lot of uncertainty, not a lot of modern medicine and sanitation, so on and so forth. But it wasn't until, again, the Industrial Revolution when death rates began to fall really significantly. And this has a lot to do with all of the massive and amazing advancements that the Industrial Revolution also put forth. So in addition to all of the changes in energy and economic structures that we were talking about before, the Industrial Revolution really set the basis as well for modern medicine, for sanitation, and introduced sanitation and the development of antiseptics. It really was transformational in terms of bettering people's lives and increasing health outcomes, increasing affluence alongside better education, better healthcare, and just the developments of societies and of countries. This has caused death rates to fall so significantly that we're now adding 1 billion people to the planet every 12 years. Again, up until 1800, it took all of human history to reach 1 billion people. Now we're adding 1 billion people to the planet every 12 years, which is unprecedented in terms of growth and portends a lot of challenges for us as we're trying to deal with, again, kind of these moments of crisis, environmentally, socially, politically, and so on. We do know that the global population is eventually going to stabilize. We don't exactly know how many people there will be on the planet whenever it does stabilize or when this is going to happen, because it depends largely on whether or not countries are able to invest in healthcare and education and slow population growth by giving people access to resources. Some estimates, well, the mainstream estimates right now from the World Bank estimate that around 2100, it's going to stabilize at probably around 11 billion people. But again, we don't actually know, because a lot of these projections, although they're usually quite accurate, are based on historical data. And there's so much going on right now that's unprecedented and that wasn't taken into account historically, that we really don't know exactly what's going to happen. We do know that the growth rate is falling and has been falling for quite some time, since about 1960. But because we have such a big base of population, even small increases in growth rate will result in massive increases of population each year. So right now we're adding 80 million people to the planet each year, even though our growth rate is very small at like 1.08%. Okay, and so in terms of population and the environment, one thing that's really important to understand first and foremost is that there's a direct correlation between population growth rate and level of development within country. In that the least developed countries are the fastest growing, they have the highest population growth rates, but the lowest environmental outputs in terms of decline. So they're not contributing very much at all to environmental degradation or climate change, but they are growing the fastest and they have the highest fertility rates. In contrast, we've got the more developed regions, places like the United States, for example, Canada, Western Europe, Australia, that are not growing very quickly at all in terms of population, but that have really high environmental outputs. So they're contributing a lot to environmental damage and a lot to climate change at the per capita and country level. As you can see, fertility rates are highest in the world's most marginalized regions. And this is a really important point, right? We can look and see that this is true across the board, where fertility rates are highest in places like Africa and sub-Saharan Africa, parts of the Middle East, parts of Asia and South Asia, parts of Latin America. And this again points to a really important distinction as we're talking about population, which is that population growth alone is not the sole or number one indicator of any type of environmental damage or ecological decline. This assertion, if it were true, would somehow indicate that that the poorest populations on the planet, people making like less than $2 a day on average, are somehow, causing the most amount of environmental damage. This is just clearly not a true statement, but it's sometimes kind of confused and oversimplified, especially in population studies, especially historically. So this is something that we need to make very clear and avoid altogether, right? But It is very important for us and advantageous for us to know from a demographic perspective where populations are growing, how fast, and at what point they're going to, peak in terms of population. This is relevant from pretty much all aspects of society and angles, but also in terms of climate adaptation and preparing for what's coming. And this slide is also a really important point because we need to be understanding the level of development and the level of industrialization that most countries are undergoing right now. So this is a slide that has infographics taken from work by Hans Rosling, who has done a lot of really great work in this space, looking at demography and future population projections and development and so on. And he has conceptualized the composition of the world's population into levels. So instead of looking at things like in a bifurcated way where there's like a developed world and a developing world, which is kind of what we've all been taught. He thinks that this is a big oversimplification and things need to be looked at more on a spectrum that's more representative of the actual present day, what's going on. And so he's done that by looking at and categorizing our population into different levels based off of relative income and population size. And as you can see, the majority of the world's population, about 5 billion people or 80% of the global population, are currently now residing on levels 2 and 3. These are what are known as middle income countries and emerging markets, and they are expected to grow very significantly into the next couple decades, as they should, right? This is a developmental trajectory that we as a global society have set forth, and it's the pathway forward towards affluence and development, right? So 80% of the world is now in this space where their affluence is increasing, right? And this is an amazing thing. Of course, all of us are advocating for this. Everybody deserves to access resources and to use them and to transcend poverty and to live better, more comfortable and healthier lives, right? And this portends a lot of really amazing things, even in terms of population growth, which is going to slow with better development, so on and so forth. So many different advantages. But from an economic perspective, I mean, an environmental perspective, we just need to be understanding and kind of preparing for what this is going to mean, that most of the world's population is now moving into these upper income brackets and going to be demanding more resources and having more expendable income to produce and consume more. So what is this going to mean, for example, for CO2 emissions? What is this going to mean for waste production, for air pollution, for arable land, for food, for water, for all of that, right? And again, to be clear, this is in no way saying that certain populations deserve to industrialize while others can't, or that there aren't enough resources to go around or anything like that. This is just to say, look at what's going on demographically. How are we going to prepare for this? And what are we going to do, given the fact that we live on a finite planet with finite resources? To me, this is like yet another reason why we need to be shifting the way that we're doing things. We need to shift our production practices away from being totally reliant on fossil fuels. Same with food. We need to change our economic structures to be way more compatible with, cohesive with the environments rather than in opposition to them, right? We can't have this like growth-based, consumption-based economy that's going to require endless growth whenever we live on this finite planet. Things need to fundamentally shift and change here. And this just, to me, speaks to another reason why. But, this is the problem that we're all trying to solve right now. We don't know the answer. All right, so in terms of population and the environment, one other aspect that I like to touch on and that I look into in my work is that of climate vulnerability. So this map we showed before, and it speaks to fertility rates globally. And the fact that fertility rates are highest in the most impoverished and marginalized regions from a climate change perspective means that more people are going to be at risk of experiencing climate impacts who lack the ability or capital to readily respond or recover. This is a really clear climate justice issue because these populations, again, have not contributed at all to the problem of climate change, but are experiencing its most severe effects and are also the most vulnerable. And just to, sort of substantiate the climate justice perspective here, it's important to understand again that people are having a lot of children in really low income areas and places with like really high fertility rates have them because of an overall lack of access to resources and because of institutionalized poverty, right? So it's not as though people are actively, because they want to, having a lot of children and having really high population growth rates. This is occurring as a direct result of a lack of access to contraceptives, a lack of access to family planning, really heavily patriarchal societies that disallow women from assuming roles outside of childbearing, and a whole host of other issues, again, that kind of have this underlying tone of poverty, right? So this is one reason, another reason why this is a climate injustice issue. All right, so according to the United Nations, the world's 47 least developed, countries are also the fastest growing, and many are projected to double in population between now and 2050. So this really increases strain on already scarce resources and really slows progress as well in both health and economic growth. As you can see by looking at this graph on the right-hand side, 9 out of the 10 most climate vulnerable countries are located in sub-Saharan Africa, which is expected to double in population by 2050. So this is portending a lot of challenges into the future. So I will go into a couple country level regional examples of this now, just to give a little bit more context. The first country I'd like to look into is that of Bangladesh, which has become a really, unfortunately, popular case of climate justice, but it's also relevant from a population perspective. So Bangladesh is about the same size as New York, but New York has 20 million people. Bangladesh has 165 million people. It's a very quickly growing middle income country and emerging market that, again, is expected to grow really significantly in upcoming years. It's expected to exceed 200 million people just by 2045. And that's according to the medium variant projection. So it could actually be much higher than that. And this is a country that is undergoing a lot of challenges that it, through no fault of its own, right? It's in a period of rapid industrialization, so it would otherwise be in a really like auspicious period of time whereby it would be mechanizing its industries, participating at higher levels in the economy, using the affluence gained in theory to expand access to healthcare and education for its people, to transcend poverty and to reach higher and higher levels of affluence, right? But because of climate change, it's constantly having to recover and respond to and rebuild from mounting climate impacts. This is all happening all the while that its carbon emissions represent a really meager fraction of the overall global total, right? So this is something that's affecting food production, that's affecting infrastructure, that's affecting development, that's moving people around and displacing them. Bangladesh, geographically speaking, is already very susceptible to climate impacts. It's very climate vulnerable because it's located in a floodplain. So similar to Louisiana in the United States, where many different tributaries and waterways come to a head over the landmass and spill into the bay, Bangladesh is in a similar position. So it's really subject to increased flooding, to sea level rise, and to sort of waterborne impacts that are really powerful and becoming more so in this particular region in South Asia. This is just a map kind of speaking to that, but also looking at one recent storm that happened a few years ago that submerged basically 40% of the entire country over the course of a month and a half, displacing millions of people, killing dozens of people, mostly women and children, and really threatening already kind of precarious infrastructure. So again, this is a country that should be developing and industrializing, but is constantly having to like really feel the effects of climate change in ways that's stifling this development. Another example is that of the Sahel region of sub-Saharan Africa. And this is the region here in green on the map. And it's representative, I think, of one of the most pressing humanitarian crises on the planet, although it's widely underreported. And it's got a confluence of issues here, among them being very rapid population growth. So it's got the fastest population growth in the entire world of any other region. And also, it's extremely vulnerable to climate change. So surface temperatures here are increasing 1.5 times faster than that of the global average. And so here, population pressures combined with really high rates of poverty, of patriarchal cultural norms, of unequal access to social and natural resources, all really fuel hunger, forced migration, incite further conflict, and further institutionalize economic stagnation. It's a really, really big issue that's not being addressed at all. And this is just a map kind of to speak to just how quickly things are burgeoning out of control. If we look at the example of food insecurity, we can see that just over the course of 1 year, because of the compounding issues of rapid population growth and climate change and the ongoing conflicts that are already existing and being exacerbated, food insecurity is becoming increasingly dire and a bigger issue. And this is something that's continuing to get worse, unfortunately, because nothing's being done and because population growth is not stopping at all. And there are many different examples of how population growth intersects with climate vulnerability. I've included a couple up here just for reference. But the main point I want to make here is that throughout the world, especially in the world's like developing regions that are trying to industrialize, climate impacts are stifling this development, even though these countries have not contributed at all to climate change. This is a really important period of time for these countries because they're undergoing the demographic transition where they, in theory, according to the development metrics that we've kind of set forth and that other countries have followed, they're trying to grasp the economic gains that can come from a large population, but also higher scale consumption and better sort of economic outputs through increased affluence and so on. And if climate impacts are threatening infrastructure and food production and economic growth, then these processes are undermined. And the effects of this, we're not quite sure, but this is a really important period of time for these countries as well. All right, so we've talked at length about the connections between population and climate vulnerability. And now I want to take this last section to talk about solutions. So looking into what investments in sustainable development, things like education or healthcare or women's empowerment, can do to help build resilience and adaptive capacity. And within these solutions is a very direct need to increase access to comprehensive reproductive health care. So I want us to be thinking about this as one very important solution to an adaptation strategy for climate change. So just so that we're all on the same page, because we're switching gears a little bit here, voluntary family planning and reproductive health care are really, really important for societies all across the world, no matter what level of development you're at, but especially for developing places, right? This is a resource that is considered internationally a human right to which everybody deserves access because it facilitates what's known as informed choice, which enables women and couples to freely and responsibly determine the number, timing, and spacing of their births. The health benefits of this resource are, I think, pretty well known. Very important for reducing maternal and mortality and morbidity, very important for reducing infant and child mortality, reducing the rate of unintended pregnancies and unsafe abortions, and increasing overall health. But also in terms of social, economic, and environmental issues, it's very, very advantageous. So voluntary family planning is fundamental for increasing education rates, for improving livelihoods, for reducing poverty, and environmentally speaking, for relieving pressure on things like natural resources, food production, infrastructure development, and so on. Slower population growth also ends up reducing the amount of people who are at risk of experiencing climate change and lessens the amount of CO2 emissions and environmental degradation over time that are put into the atmosphere or incurred through extractive processes or resource use or whatever. So coupled with family planning, very importantly is that of education. So this is a really important, aspect of this resource and of this solution. It's not usually enough just to go into places that have otherwise no exposure to this type of a resource, to family planning or to contraceptives, and to just like build a healthcare facility and make resources available. Although that is what happens sometimes, it's really important to also integrate education about family planning and reproductive health, yes, but also about just in general, like women, children, boys, men, everybody within communities and societies needs to be educated, right? Because very fundamentally, education yields independent and even critical thought, which are very necessary in overcoming or transcending some of the very traditional or cultural norms or barriers that might otherwise prevent people from using such an advantageous resource. From a more social perspective, when education levels rise for women and girls, they gain access to various forms of power in social, economic, and political spheres. Higher levels of education yield more options for sustained employment and help increase livelihoods. This increases resources to help people and families choose how and when to start a family. So overall, statistically speaking, women who are educated tend to have fewer, healthier children. And this is something that we can see play out very clearly throughout the world. So no matter where you are or what the religious affiliation may be or what the cultural norms may say, really one of the biggest indicators of how many children a woman chooses to have throughout her lifetime is educational attainment, because with education comes opportunity and the propensity to marry later and pursue goals prior to childbearing. And this is all to say that family planning, of course, needs to be considered a human right, most fundamentally so, but it's kind of beyond that. It's much bigger than that as well. It's also very central to women's empowerment, to reducing poverty, to building climate resilience, and to achieving sustainable development. And worldwide, this is really important because there is a confluence of issues affecting the very same, already very marginalized places. So they're really the same places with really high levels of climate vulnerability also have really low levels of education, really low income statuses, and really high unmet needs for family planning. Meeting unmet needs in these regions would directly help people to gain better access to healthcare, become healthier, and be more able to respond and recover from and move if they need to, and just sort of adapt to a changing climate. And there's a lot of research substantiating this fact, looking at and really making the correlation between meeting unmet needs for family planning and reproductive health and benefiting climate adaptation. The reasons for this are pretty straightforward. Obviously, whenever women and children gain access to healthcare, they become healthier. This is a fundamental aspect of building resilience. Also, women become more empowered whenever they're able to choose when and how to start a family. This increases possibilities for engaging in adaptation efforts. Over time, rates of unintended pregnancies drop and slower population growth ensues, both resulting in a reduced demand for resources and fewer people being exposed to climate impacts. And finally, in terms of the propensity to actually mitigate climate change by offsetting emissions over time, meeting unmet needs for family planning and education worldwide is very, very effective in this space. This is, again, research taken from Project Drawdown, and this is an organization that does a ton of different research, different types of research, but they essentially rank different climate solutions based off of various indicators like upfront cost, return on investments, and basically what it's going to take to implement that resource over a certain period of time. And as you can see, by meeting these unmet needs for family planning and education globally, just by giving people access to the resources they're already saying they want, could reduce emissions up to almost 70 gigatons of CO2 by 2050. This makes it the third most viable and effective solution out of a list of over 83 different solutions posted on Project Drawdown's website. And I've only included 10 here because there's no space, but yeah, it's ranked third out of 83 different solutions for, again, upfront cost, return on investment. For every $1 spent on international family planning aid, $120 is yielded in returns. And this is because this is a resource that really changes lives through empowerment. It gives people access to resources that allow them to have more bodily autonomy and, make more, have more decisions and opportunities in life. These are also resources that are passed down from generation to generation and so compound over time. I want to make clear that this is an ancillary point. Family planning is most fundamentally about human rights, and it's worthy of achieving in and of itself. But given the fact that there are really high levels of funding gaps that exist for fully meeting these needs, I think that this, to me, speaks to the potential to create more pathways for funding from different sources to close these gaps. And so that's what we work on. We want to make sure everybody everywhere has access to the full spectrum of reproductive care, so that they can engage autonomously with their lives. And right now in LMICs alone, or low to middle income countries, over 218 million women are considered to have an unmet need for modern contraception because they want to avoid pregnancy but are not currently using any modern form of contraception. This results in a lot of different negative health outcomes, unfortunately, statistically speaking. But in terms of unintended pregnancies, it produces about 111 million unintended pregnancies annually. In contrast, if all unmet needs were met and if everybody was able to receive care at the benefits or at the levels recommended by the World Health Organization, the impacts would be enormous. There would be a 68% drop in unintended pregnancies, a 72% reduction in unsafe abortions, and a 62% reduction in maternal deaths. So really from all angles, from the social, economic, and environmental standpoints, we can look at and see that this is a really effective way to help the world achieve a higher level of sustainability and livelihood. One aspect of our organization focuses politically to increase, as I said before, US aid for family planning programs. This is because right now there's currently a $5.5 billion funding gap annually for fully meeting these needs globally. That's with all of the different contributors combined at the country level, at the organization level, at the individual level. With everybody contributing all of their resources combined, there's still this $5.5 billion annual funding gap that exists. The United States is consistently the biggest contributor of such aid, but it represents a very small fraction of our budget, and our stance is that we could be allocating more, especially because of our place in climate change, the capacity for this resource to do so much good, and I guess just also in comparison to what we're actually spending it on now. Also, family planning for what we work on in terms of policy is to streamline access to family planning and funding for family planning. I think we're all well aware that reproductive rights are a highly partisan issue, especially now. So it really depends who's in power, who's going, the extent to which family planning is going to be funded and the limitations under which it's going to be allocated. So we work on different policies to streamline this funding and to make sure that this resource is widely available both domestically and internationally. All right, so that concludes things. Thanks very much for listening. We've talked about a lot of information today, and I hope that Some of it was useful or even interesting. We've talked a lot about the connections between population and climate change and different rights-based solutions rooted in gender equality that will positively affect efforts to mitigate the effects of climate change as well as increase resilience. Please feel free to reach out to me anytime at this email. I would love to hear from you and happy to answer any questions that you guys have now.
Hannah, that's great. If you would stop screen sharing, then I can see the gallery and if anybody has questions. We generally are going to go until about 10 or 12 after and allow people to fire a question at you if they have one. You can use your raise hand feature, or maybe I'll see you. I don't know. A lot of things that I saw in there that I would love to talk more about. I'll just start off with one question. We have a very active group that goes down to Guatemala and works with the women in the highlands. It'd be great to see what they do versus what your organization might say they should be doing. They're doing some reforestation. They're working on health. They're working on capital, giving them capital to control their own lives and get some, some more stability and power in the women area. And I wonder if there's gaps that you would identify if they had a chance to talk to you, but we'll take that one offline. And I see a question.
Great.
And I can, if they would unmute, it just says iPad on that question. I don't know who that is.
Is it Maria, possibly?
Yes, go ahead.
So Hannah, thank you for that wonderful and compelling presentation. I would like to hear your thoughts on what are the obstructions, the political and global obstructions that you see that kind of thwarts the education and empowerment of women. I think of what's happening in our own country, and I think it's very hypocritical of us when we are taking away women's reproductive rights in this country. We're tampering, of course, abortions are no longer legal in most states. We're stopping birth control and really impairing women's access to health, which includes things like birth control and prepartum and postpartum health. So how do you see this working out globally in other countries that are very patriarchal and have a very maybe fixed view of the position of women in their society? I'd like to know what you think about that.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's best approached sort of situationally, like looking at specific countries and regions, because everywhere is a little different. But certainly there are a lot of cultural and traditional barriers that exist to fully realizing education and access to healthcare. But I think that, one sort of natural consequence of increases in affluence is more people, women included, gaining access to the workforce and becoming educated at higher levels. It's just sort of the path forward that makes the most sense economically. So unfortunately, it has to be put in these terms, but every country that has sort of industrialized and reached an affluent state has also achieved a higher level of gender equality just by virtue of the economic structure changing and more people participating in it. And the pathway forward for that is education. And of course, there's a really high level of political corruption and an unwillingness to change. But I felt really hopeful by the experiences that I've had getting to travel to Africa and to Asia, and to work with different organizations and even some government officials who are trying to increase access to healthcare, working in rural and urban environments to expand education and to shift these cultural norms. Within the context of like sexual and reproductive health, it's something that does take a long time, right? It's not something that happens overnight. But there are amazing stories that I've been able to hear about and even see realized in communities where peers are educating each other about the importance of slowing population growth and like having fewer children and allowing for gender equality to ensue. You remember the story that I told at the very beginning where these programs are empowering women to become decision makers and to become educated in certain spheres and to really transform these sort of gender identities and roles. And it's interesting to hear the men talk about this as well, because they are at first very hesitant and reluctant, but over time really see the power and the necessity in shifting things and in empowering individuals to realize their full potentials. So I think that things are really changing, especially at the more local levels. Yes, at the higher levels, we've got a ton of corruption in our country and every other country as well. But I don't want that to disillusion us to what's actually happening on the ground in many places, which is very empowering and very hopeful in my experience. It's a great question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Moira, you have a question?
Thanks, Roger. Hannah, thank you. I learned so much from you. I'd like to know more about the organization. Can you tell us how it got started, when, where, funding sources, how big it is, that kind of information?
Sure. Thank you. So this organization has been around actually since about 1968, and it was originally called Zero Population Growth. I don't know if many of you have heard of it before. We've totally transformed our mission and our goals and our work to be more in line with like present day. And we focus very much on international development within the context of everything that I was talking about during the presentation. But that's its origins. And now we have our headquarters is in DC, and we have a small development office in San Diego, but many people are working remotely. And yeah, we are pretty much entirely funded by individual donors. Yes. We also work and have international partners throughout Latin America, Asia, and Africa. Did I answer all of your questions?
You did. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. We've got about, I think it's 20,000 members across the US.
Dave, you have a question?
Yeah, Hannah, thank you for that great presentation. And I have a question and an observation. The observation is that it's awfully depressing to think that if the measure of a women's life or the quality of women's life is that difference between birth rates, how far so many billion of women are from having a life that they would really want for themselves. That's a pretty depressing thought. The question is this: I was trying to go back to understand the number on your chart for the savings in terms of carbon emissions, I guess, that would result from slowing population growth. I have all sorts of questions about how that number was computed, but let me try to ask it this way. I understood from your presentation that there are a variety of dynamics that go into the carbon emissions, industrialization, increasing affluence, and the increasing energy demands being made by more and more affluent people. I guess the question I have is that does that number, that reduction in the number, does that assume that if we lowered the birth rate around the world to something approaching the zero growth or 2% or whatever the right number might be, that would be the reduction, even if those people moved up in the affluence scale and increased their energy demands?
That's a great question. And I think the answer is what you're trying to get at is, doesn't it have to do more with like consumption levels and resource use, right? Where did you go?
Yeah, I'm here. I'm
Yeah,
here.
okay, there you are. Um, yes, and you're right that we need to, the fact is, like what I was talking about before, there's a really small portion of the overall population that's consuming the majority of the resources. So it's not only about population, but there's so many people in these like low to middle income brackets that are currently existing in these situations where they're having more children as a consequence of poverty and sort of against, not against their will necessarily, but in many cases, yes, but operating in less than equal space. And, you know, because there's so many people in this space, if fully like education and family planning were realized, then slower population growth would ensue. And yeah, that would have the biggest impact. But those estimates also include, they're worldwide. So they also include the United States and other industrialized places, like realizing education there as well. But you're right in that, you know, it's not just about making sure that everybody everywhere has healthcare and education. That's one aspect of it, but there's other fundamental issues, which are that as affluence increases, which is what populations are doing around the world, and they should, we have this like incompatible relationship with the environment, whereby people's lives get better and the environmental our environments get worse, right? So that speaks to a fundamental issue in our economy, in my eyes, that we need to like address and work on, that we don't know the answer to, right? That we're still kind of driving ourselves into the ground here, but the answer is both, and that's a great question. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks.
Sandy, do you have a question?
Yes, well, first I wanted to thank you for your wonderful presentation. And then I had to say that it reminds me of a book I read so many years ago, but it just popped right up in my mind. It's called Half the Sky. And it's just such a great book about the importance of empowering women. And I just was thinking it's such a great resource, and through reading that book, it highlights so many organizations trying to do just what your organization is doing, which is trying to educate and empower women, basically. And the title of the book is Because Women Hold Up Half the Sky. That's why it's called that.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing.
Any other questions? I do have one comment for Hannah, that we have a monthly article that one of our Earth Care members writes, and the article that was of interest was the one that they looked at what individuals can do and what were the main things and the most important things that an individual can do. And when that article came to me, I said, well, one of the most important things, of course, is, you know, family planning and perhaps reducing the number of children. And the immediate pushback was, well, you don't want to shame anybody. And so we have this barrier of being unable to discuss some really basic things for fear of, I guess, making it a partisan issue, or it's just a more difficult conversation than saying, well, you should go buy an electric vehicle, which somebody could say, well, maybe I should, maybe I shouldn't, and they can evaluate that. But when you say, well, maybe you should have one less child,
Right.
it really gets tough.
Yeah. Yeah. And this speaks to the complexity and the nuance of the issue. It's not as straightforward as like, you know, like conservation, or as you said, the example that you gave, the electric vehicle example. I just like to say, well, just according to the numbers, the best way that you can reduce emissions is by choosing to have one or fewer children. Then next, it's reducing food waste. Next, it's eating a green plant-based diet just by giving people like the facts. But of course, our organization and anybody working in this space should never like try to be coercive about how many children people have or judgmental, right? This is a really personal decision, and it's everybody's lives. Like if people want to have 8 children, then we as an organization are okay with that. But we just recognize that, you know, statistically speaking, worldwide, people are not doing this on their own accord, but rather because of these other sort of inequities that exist that are producing these imbalances, right? Yeah, so that's kind of what we focus on. It's a good question, though. It's definitely something that comes up a lot in this work. Yeah, it's a contentious issue. It's very personal.
Dave, if you have a quick one, we'll let you have it, but
It's probably not. I was going to ask about China, which had the one-child policy for a long time and has also tremendously contributed to the increased emissions that are occurring because of their extraordinary economic growth. But now they're switching and they're trying to incentivize women to have more children. And I'm wondering, what's your reaction to that? And why are they trying to increase birth rates? That's not a short answer or a short question, so I'll withdraw it if you want.
No, it's okay. I can try to answer it quickly. It's a great question, and it's something that's totally related to this work. But essentially, China has undergone a lot in the past like few decades, where they had the famine in the 30s, and then afterwards implemented this population control measure because they were worried it was going to happen again, and because of population quote unquote explosion that they were like thinking that was going to happen. So they forcibly enacted this measure, and it was very coercive, very oppressive, and very traumatic for a lot of the population. And it actually resulted in like a population decline. So it like shrank the population down, created this like imbalance between women and men because there was a preference for men over women. And then shrank the population down so that now there's going to be more old people than young people, which creates a lot of havoc for the economy. So now they're like painting over all of the propaganda for one child and putting have 3 children now. And it doesn't work because this is a society that's largely traumatized from really some of the like most harrowing stories of people being coercively pushed into childbearing in a particular way, and also because of gender equality, where women are having to take on a lot of the economic burdens of having children with no help from the government.
Thank you.
I'm going to let that be the last question, and we'll let Hannah go and say thank you so much. Great presentation, lots of things to think about. Dave and I are going to do a little series in the fall. We probably are going to steal a couple of your slides.
Yeah.
If that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to help.
More than a couple.
All right. I'll let you all go. I'm supposed to say what is happening next week on Peace and Justice, and I didn't write it down. So shame on me. But we'll stop recording, and thank you, Hannah, very much for everything.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for the great questions.
Thank
Have
you.
a great night.
You.
Take
Good
care.
night.
Good night. Bye-bye.